Welcome back to the Metahumanism channel. Today I'll talk about what philosophy is and what the major branches of philosophy are. For those of you in a hurry, here's a quick answer. It's pursuit of truth and wisdom, it's a way of life, and it's a way of engaging with the world. That's it. You can now move on with your busy life, and if you're interested, come back to this video when you hit a bit more, have a little bit more leisure, and explore explore these things. This video addresses the accelerated speed inherent in our postmodern lives today, or meta-modern lives, if you will. And on the whole, I advocate for a return to greater slowness in life. And Milan Kundera, one of my favorite novelists, Czech novelist who immigrated to France and then started writing in French subsequently. He wrote a novel later in his life called Slowness, based on this very notion of slowing down and finding more meaning in that. Okay, so let me track back a little bit. I am Bohdan, for those who are just joining this channel. And if you haven't watched my first video, in my introductory video, I encourage you to do so, where you can learn more about who I am and my background a little bit, and my approach to this channel. This is the second in my initial series of introductory videos, laying the groundwork for what's to come next. What this channel will be about and what to expect. So, basically defining what philosophy is a part of that introductory series. It's my lifelong belief that everything, all knowledge in life is downstream from philosophy. It's and by philosophy here we mean thinking, pursuit of knowledge, meaning, culture, how we use language to communicate in various ways with one another, through mass media, in politics, also such down-to-earth, bread and butter practical matters as how we govern ourselves and others, and how we make our living, which is politics and economics. Philosophy is just as integral and important for those practical pursuits as it is to more theoretical and abstract, possibly, ones. So if you wanted a clear sign that philosophy is relevant, take a recent statement by the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who said that she's basing her politics, she's a conservative figure, she's basing her politics in the civilization, she believes in the civilization built on Greek philosophy, Roman law, and Christian values. That's what her statement was. So whatever your response or reaction to that statement, whatever your own position may be on it, it clearly points to the connections between philosophy and theory and the real life, quote unquote, of practical matters. So I also believe that today we place much too importance and value into data, statistics, and information, while the true understanding of what all that data and information means for us as living beings is lost. So information has to be translated into knowledge and then further into wisdom to mean anything or to be applicable to human life. Just pure knowledge and pure data is meaningless and just noise. And that's what this channel is about, really, is to create, to focus on wisdom and knowledge and try to reduce the noise or make sense of the noise. An apt metaphor that some people use, there's actually a book by that name, is The Matrix Society. I will link to it in the description, but basically the idea is that the big data, the digital surveillance, and the neoliberal governance which is focused kind of on individuals as atoms, social atoms. So each individual as kind of a separate, very individualistic perspective. So that kind of neoliberal governments is used, big data and surveillance are used to measure, to quantify, to predict, and to algorithmically control every aspect of our lives, really. Our health, including our health, our minds, our work, and our education. And it's kind of a very dystopian, it can be very dystopian if taken to certain logical conclusions, and but not everyone is sufficiently critical, sufficiently skeptical about that process, instead cheers it on and wants it to accelerate. They are called accelerationists. They are also, a lot of them also hold to transhumanist perspective, which we will discuss in the next video. So that's highly relevant to what we'll be doing on this channel. Now, each of us is already a philosopher, whether we realize it or not. Even if we don't think of ourselves this way, whether we recognize it or not, we are philosophers just by being living beings. We all operate in our lives based on some set of more or less explicit and conscious, or more or less implicit and unconscious theories about how life works, and the world and society. So based on those theories, we act and we behave. And they are sometimes based in unexamined beliefs on what we were taught in school, by our parents, by church, other institutions, and also based on from our own experience, what we went through. For example, maybe a trauma informs how we behave, or success, or certain experience early in life that primes people to success, because they received certain instruction or certain model of behavior that they were able to imitate and become also successful, for example, or the other way, unsuccessful, or because they imitate someone who gave them a flawed model of behavior. So philosophy is just a process of making these theories that we all operate on more rather than less explicit and conscious. So it's just a principled investigation of theories and ideas, and making them conscious and so more controlled by ourselves, not by our unconscious and other processes. Earlier today, I came across this excellent quote from philosopher Bertrand Russell. And I'll link to him as well if you want to know more. But the quote goes is, he lived in the beginning of 20th century. His work is quite important in formal logic and other areas. So people's opinions are mainly designed to make them feel comfortable. Truth for most people is a secondary consideration. So philosophy is the exact opposite of what that quote describes. It's, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as many philosophers are, it's a pursuit of truth, which is prioritized over many of the other values, including comfort, for example. It's well known that Socrates, a kind of quintessential figure of a philosopher, a model philosopher, did not write anything down. He just simply went around conversing with people, asking questions and questioning their beliefs, and incessantly, without stopping and without having too many limits on what he questioned. So one of Plato's dialogues about Socrates, Plato was the one who wrote down his ideas and what Socrates taught, so one of the dialogues is entitled The Apology, which is actually, it means vindication, a justification of Socrates' life and method. It doesn't mean the apology in a sense of asking plea for forgiveness. It's a matter of justifying his beliefs. And so one famous quote from that work belongs to Socrates, who says that an unexamined life is not worth living. That's the idea, is that philosophy is about examining what life means. So know thyself is basically another way of saying it, and that's both Greeks and Romans after them emphasize that that notion of knowing your own mind and how it works first and foremost. And if you, I'm sure many of you watching this have seen the movie The Matrix, and that basically, that quote, "Know thyself," it was hanging above the door in the apartment of the Oracle when Neo comes to visit her. And that movie in general is kind of jam-packed with all kinds of profound philosophical ideas that are kind of extracted from their original cultural context and placed in the new context. Well, it was new in 1999 when the movie came out, and that context basically being postmodern world and cyberspace, cyber culture. And it's kind of, it's hard to imagine that it's been almost 30 years since that movie came out, and it's a pill that is neither red nor blue, but a bitter one to swallow for me nevertheless, because I realize that I'm no longer 18 anymore. Now, similarly to Plato's Socrates, a 19th century liberal thinker, John Stuart Mill, in his work Utilitarianism from 1863, argued that it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. In a sense, it's better to be a philosopher, to know how your mind works in that sense, even if that knowledge may not always be comfortable or pleasant, and it certainly does not come cheaply, the process of examining your beliefs. So that means the philosophy is often not for the faint of heart. It requires courage to examine, to question the received truths and your beliefs, your typical beliefs that you go on living with, or at least at some point you have to make a decision to examine them and not just believe whatever you want to believe or whatever you were taught to believe by parents, society, and school, and so on. I personally learned this particular truth first by reading Friedrich Nietzsche, another 19th century German philosopher, professor of philology, which was it's an equivalent of modern field of linguistics. And so he's we'll definitely talk about Nietzsche a lot, I'm sure, in the future videos, but he's most scandalously known for saying, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him." Obviously, it will require at least a full video, if not a series of videos, to examine what exactly is it that he meant to say by that, and it's not as simple as it seems on the surface. And at some point we'll get to it. Now, it is also possible to look at what philosophy is from a sociological perspective. So philosophy is situated in the field of the humanities, more broadly, or in Anglophone world is known as liberal arts, and often today includes disciplines like history, in addition to philosophy, history, linguistics, religious studies, various artistic disciplines, various arts, and some others. Let me also add that all true knowledge, I believe, all true knowledge is interdisciplinary. The disciplinary boundaries are largely arbitrary, even though they are sometimes just no less real and frequently all too rigid and are completely arbitrary, really. Knowledge crosses those boundaries very easily, because if you're studying, let's say, political science, you have to know sociology and other fields of society, and you can't just focus merely on politics and ignore everything else that happens around politics. Although some people do, and that's why they make mistakes. That's how science, social science, or any science makes mistakes, by forgetting that knowledge is interdisciplinary and these boundaries are largely arbitrary. And most of the early philosophers have all been interdisciplinary. It was something that today we call them as polymaths, meaning that they had knowledge and expertise in various fields of knowledge, because it was easier to do back then, because there was less of knowledge, less of information, less of data to process and to learn. But it was easier, but still, interdisciplinarity has come back. It's been in recent decades, it's been emphasized by many, and it rightfully so, in my opinion. So based on that sociological perspective, I see philosophy as kind of an intellectual practice. So it's as I said, it's a way of engaging with the world. It's not just theory. It's practical also. That's why we say that a person does philosophy or philosophizes. It's an action, a verb, and that puts primacy on the human capital, which in turn depends on other forms of capital such as cultural, social, and symbolic. Or in other terms, cultural is one's access to high quality of cultural knowledge, education, skills. Social capital is one's position in society and social networks, and one's symbolic capital is one's status, prestige, honor, or reputation. These concepts, all of these various forms of capital, come from a French sociologist and anthropologist, Pierre Bourdieu, who has passed away in early 2000s, I believe. But he's been, as a sociologist, he's one of my favorite ones, and so we'll probably discuss them in future videos in more detail. In simplest terms, those forms of capital, basically, it's who you are, depends on what you know, who you know, and what others think of you. In connection to this, I also came across another great quote today saying, worry about your character, not your reputation. Your character is who you are, and your reputation is what who others think you are. So that's just an example of an ethical and moral exhortation, a kind of a principle to suggesting authenticity and being yourself is important to ethical behavior and to morality. And such statement is an example of one major branch of philosophy called ethics, which we'll talk about that in a minute, about the branches. Philosophy can also be difficult to understand, and that's that's why a lot of people are turned off, or they think they're not smart enough, or not, don't or reject it, and have this kind of anti-intellectual attitude towards philosophy. They think it's abstract, it's unrelated to life, it's unnecessary. Couldn't be more wrong, in my opinion. It is difficult to understand often. Especially if you read original philosophical works, but it doesn't have to be. It's anything math, any subject can be made accessible and interesting if approached appropriately. Moreover, I think it's often it is even designed, so can be difficult, but what I want to say is that sometimes it's designed to be difficult by the philosophers themselves. They deliberately write in a difficult and abstruse manner that's not easy to interpret. And there could be a few reasons for that, and I'll discuss them in a second. Further than that, sometimes even the style, beyond the style, that the philosophers sometimes may encode certain hidden messages into their text, into their writings purposefully, and it's known as esoteric writing. So the superficial, ostensible meaning of what the text says hides the deeper meaning, by implication, truer meaning of the intentions of the author. So this obviously presents a significant problem in terms of interpretation, and we'll be discussing that also in the future. Interpretation and how you reach the meaning and know what somebody is saying or writing. Is whether it reflects the truth or what their intentions or opinions directly. There are maybe several reasons for this difficulty for philosophers using these tactics and strategies to write abstrusely and to write esoterically. One, the simplest, most basic reason, not about esotericism, but about the difficulty of reading philosophy, is that it's not always easy to find simple and intuitive language to describe or to deal with profound matters that examine the very nature of language or reality or intuition or possibility of us gaining knowledge about the world, and so on. That requires difficult concepts, difficult language that sometimes needs to be invented, or new concepts need to be constructed, and in philosophy that happens all the time. And so the results tend to be couched in kind of complicated conceptual terminology and vocabulary that is inaccessible without preparation, and can be and so the words, these concepts are defined in a very specific and peculiar way that's not intuitive, or without, as I said, preparation and grappling with what they mean. Another practical reason for this difficulty of reading philosophy could be self-protection, and this is more related to the esotericism. In certain, throughout history, in certain periods, I believe, for example, I mentioned in the previous video that Socrates was put to death by the Athenians because he was accused of morally corrupting the youth by making them question their beliefs, right? And he was put to death. That's what Apology, and there's three dialogues written by Plato. Apology is one of them, examines that historical event. Ancient philosophers Athenian philosophers frequently went into exile rather than, face death. They just ran away to save themselves, but Socrates refused to do that because of holding unpopular ideas and views. And so that prominent example is kind of summarizes the relationship between philosophy and politics sometimes, because the habit of those who have political power to persecute those freely engaging in philosophy and questioning and pursuing truth, who may have some heretical or unpopular ideas about politics and religion and so on, so that dynamic has not disappeared and has become more pronounced, if anything, through the ages. And by making their views less comprehensible, philosophers may be protecting themselves from such persecution by encoding the hidden message by paying lip service to whatever the received opinion of the day is, but then truly saying something else, which only those kind of who understand their method is able to approach it. Only somebody who is a philosopher and who thinks critically will recognize that. So it's still a difficulty. Interpretation is often very difficult, but that's part of the practice of philosophy. It's kind of a plausible deniability for philosophers by writing in that way. And finally, another possible reason, there's maybe others, but this is the final one I want to discuss, is a very banal one. It's gatekeeping. If professional and academic philosophers in recent modern times may engage in efforts to keep others out of the profession because they think they're less capable or less educated or less worthy, and so they're bound to challenge those without symbolic capital, right? So they use their prestige and their reputation to keep others out, to write more difficult, more abstrusely, in a more difficult manner. Like German, for example, a lot of like Kant and other German philosophers, they're notorious for having written in a very difficult language to understand and interpret, and it's difficult to get through those texts even today. And they have important ideas, but it's still difficult style of writing, for example. So to sum up the preceding discussion so far, is the wider world is built on the very ideas that philosophizing produces. We live in the results of past philosophies which became embodied. As I said, it's a way of engaging with the world. Politics is based on politically philosophical ideas, and so but it is also built on other dogmas, meaning unexamined beliefs and just statements that are sort of taken as true without examining them, just for people are forced or driven to believe certain statements, religions, for example, or even political ideas. They are taken on faith, and they're not necessarily examined critically sufficiently enough, and so people, they have been in the past, but then today people just accept them as natural and don't question them, but maybe they should. So the argument, and an argument could be made and is made by some philosophers that piety and reverence for received wisdom, for dogmas and certain myths is a good thing for society because it's pragmatic for society to believe in these certain things for stability, right? And there may be some truth to that notion. I'm not going to reject it outright, but depending on the context and circumstances. But I already pointed out in my last video that piety is not high on my list of virtues or values. So that's my choice, and each one has to make it for themselves. But that's, critical examination of ideas and received ideas is of prime importance to me. In the end, it just highlights the very nature of thinking. Many questions do not have any final definitive answers, and one must keep grappling with them continually, possibly coming up with different answers in different periods of moments in life, in one life, your own life. You may have different philosophies and ideas as you go and progress and evolve in your thinking and develop in different situations, or even within one moment in your life, in different situations, you may apply different aspects of philosophy. Now, let's move on to discuss and briefly summarize the main branches of the philosophical endeavor. At its basis, philosophy is basically just thinking important things in life, given the practice that the practice of philosophy has existed for thousands of years now, a certain body of methods, specializations, and perspectives have invariably accumulated, and that's why studying the history of philosophy is very important and I would say integral to understanding and philosophizing today. Rather than just doing it in a vacuum, because as the saying goes, if you don't know the past, you're doomed to repeat it, right? So knowing the history of philosophy and the errors it's made, and it's made a few throughout history, because philosophers are human beings, and human beings are have a propensity to err, to make mistakes. That we are all human, even the philosophers. So there's no exception there. Just as with any sphere of human endeavor, there's a long history of various mistakes, and some of these mistakes have had horrible practical implications. Let's take just the first thing that comes to mind is Marx and his philosophy, and the political really it was a political religion constructed based on his ideas by Lenin and Stalin and Mao, had terrible consequences, and that's just one example, fairly recent one in our lives, but it's not the only one. Or divine rights of kings. That's a philosophical idea that was just to justify the rule, the absolutist rule of one person over others. It's now bankrupt. That idea is no longer accepted really in most societies in most of the world, but still that's within the history of philosophy. Of political philosophy anyway. So that's another reason that motivated me to start this channel, is that to advocate for reasoning and for thinking well, and to highlight bad ideas that have terrible consequences for all of us, and to highlight them clearly and unequivocally. So let me bring up something else I said in my previous video, namely, in reference to the Russian aggression in Ukraine, I said that truth and reality go on existing independently of how deluded or misinformed we are. And that may sound intuitive on the surface, but believe it, it's not, because it's not such a simple proposition as it may seem. Philosophers famously disagree pretty much on every little thing they can. If there's any position to take, you will always find several schools of philosophers on disagreeing on it, invariably. That's both the beauty and the frustration of being human and engaging in thinking and reasoning. It's no wonder the philosophers have disagreed and will probably always continue to disagree for as long as philosophy continues to exist about the nature of reality, such great things as reality and truth. I'll examine these issues in greater depth in future videos, but just for now, these are the two major areas of investigations, philosophical investigation, that developed into what is known as metaphysics, or speculations about what is real and what exists, and epistemology, or speculations about what is true and how we can know the truth. In the political realm, Language and rhetoric and logic and argumentation are often used in a very emotional way, designed to elicit strong emotions, manipulate them for various purposes, some of which are nefarious, others less so, more benign. And that's why the disciplines of grammar and rhetorics, logic and reasoning have always been at the center of a good, well-rounded humanist education since the ancient times and until today. Well, there are some issues with decline in humanist education. That's kind of one of the another motivating factors for me to highlight and call my channel Metahumanism. So that's based on what I just said. That's the third branch of philosophy, in addition to metaphysics and epistemology, is logic. Logic is the third. It's a mastery of language and reasoning, and that's the third major branch of philosophy. Not in a particular order, but sort of it logically sort of flows out of it. Reality, truth. How do you know the truth? You need logic to know the reality and truth. Kind of, it's interconnected. This also points to politics. As I said, it's used politically, rhetoric and so on, logic. It points to politics as being a separate and specialized field of philosophy. So there's 5 major branches, which I've already named 3, and political philosophy is a separate specialized field in addition to those 5 major ones. It's more of a field of application, applied philosophy, where your more, theoretical speculations are applied in to more practical matters. In addition to those humanist disciplines I just mentioned, there are also, in ancient times, there were poetry and history. And those actually preceded philosophy in time. Think about Homer and his epics, Iliad and Odyssey. Think about Hesiod, one of the earliest poets, and his mythological theogony, which examines the origins of the world and the gods that were the ancient Greek gods. So they came before history as a discipline, or first writers like Herodotus, and subsequently philosophy like pre-Socratic philosophers, and then Socrates and everybody else, Plato and Aristotle, came and emerged as more rational and more empirical investigations of reality. Mythology, poetry is more based on emotions and non-examined beliefs, or just dogmas, if you will, certain way of looking at the world or understanding the origin of the world and where we come from. And then history and philosophy was more of let's look at this reasonably, rationally, and examine it carefully. Philosophical attitudes toward poetry differed. Pre-Socratics critiqued poetry. Homer's, for example, epics and language use and whatever, they critiqued it. Then Plato was outright hostile to poetry, to poets, and saying they should be excluded from society even. And Aristotle, after him, was more inclusive and more open-minded and sympathetic. He saw some uses for poetry in society and thought it was an important endeavor. But he still emphasized philosophy as more important even as a practice. But regardless of those differing attitudes, and throughout the ages, obviously that attitude, those kind of attitudes also varied throughout all societies and different approaches in the world. But that kind of opposition of philosophy and poetry, that basic kind of opposition between the two, between the systematic reasoning and rational inquiry on one side, which is philosophy, and a more emotional and mystical tradition of poetry and mythology on the other, they're kind of, in some ways there's tension, and it remains true to this day. Despite some attempts to reconcile and to find common themes in both these endeavors. I can give you an example of one such conciliatory attempt. It was during the Italian Renaissance, for example, the humanism. The Italian poet Petrarch, he saw poetry as a form of philosophy, for example. I think he even wrote a work called Poet as Philosopher, or something similar. he viewed the difference more in form between poetry and philosophy less important than the similarity of expressed content, which is thought and reflection about life and different spheres of life. So you can write poetically about life and reflect on life, or you can write philosophically more in prose or in more rational argument. But there at bottom you can have philosophy grounding poetic expression as well. That was Petrarch's argument. So the fourth branch of philosophy, flowing out of this, just discussion of poetry and philosophy and the tension and so on, is the aesthetics. That's the fourth field. It's the speculations with regard to correct aesthetic criteria and judgments of taste. What is beautiful, taste and distinction in art, including, of course, poetry. These are the matters of aesthetics, a fourth branch of philosophy. Aristotle's Poetics, for example, is one example. I think it's one of the first works, systematic works, that apply rational and moral criteria to poetics, to creative pursuits and to aesthetic judgments, for example. And so he introduces the final and major branch of philosophy, which is ethics, which is the study of morality, study of what is right and wrong. So let's just quickly recap. Metaphysics, study of reality. Epistemology, study of knowledge and truth. Logic, study of reasoning and language. And aesthetics is study of judgment and taste and beauty. And lastly, ethics, not least, but last in this list, is a study of morality and what is right and wrong, and is ethics. There's this is a great point for me to just read out this quote by Ursula K, a writer some of you may be familiar with. I just came across with it several days ago. Socrates said, the misuse of language induces evil in the soul. He wasn't talking about grammar. To misuse language is to use it the way politicians and advertisers do, for profit, without taking responsibility for what the words mean. Language used as a means to get power or make money goes wrong. It lies. Language used as an end in itself, to sing a poem or tell a story, goes right, goes towards the truth. A writer is a person who cares what words mean, what they say, and how they say it. Writers know words are their way towards truth and freedom, and so they use them with care, with thought, with fear, with delight. By using words well, they strengthen their souls. Storytellers and poets spend their lives learning that skill and art of using words well, and their words make the souls of their readers stronger, brighter, deeper. I think I will end with this quote, and because that is a beautiful quote, and that is also part of what I would like to do with this channel and with everything I will be posting on it. So thank you for your attention once again. Please support Ukraine. I will include the links to organizations. Please support this channel, like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.